next speaker, I found a couple years ago on YouTube, and I subscribed right away. I was very impressed with how he deals with science and a lot of the myths that people have about science. It was kind of a little bit difficult to get here. He's from Dallas, Texas. They got a foot of snow yesterday. So his flight was canceled. We got him a second flight, which stopped in Atlanta. And guess who got snow next? So about 4 o'clock in the morning, we finally picked Aaron up, got him into bed, and he was kind of pressed for time this morning. All right. So a lot of you in the audience already know who Aaron Roth is. So I'm going to hand the mic over to him and hope you enjoy it. Thanks.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me come down. It's an honor to be invited. I've never been to Florida. I'm happy to be here. It looks nice. Who would have thought Florida would be pretty? Dallas normally is too, but you have plants here I've never seen. It's great to get out, especially when you got a foot of snow at home. And that told me as soon as I got here that this is what winter is like here in Florida. I thought, well, spring comes early. For those of you who don't know who I am, to adequately introduce myself, one of the first things I feel like to tell you is that I spend way too much of my time debating evolution versus creationism. I'm embarrassed to admit how much of my life I've dedicated to this particular venture, especially over the last decade or so. Almost since I discovered the internet, I happened across this debate, and I've been inextricably involved with it ever since. And before Y2K, I used to work for an internet service provider that offered unlimited overtime and unbridled browsing on a high-speed connection for 70 to 100 hours a week. And I investigated everything. I was suddenly on a learning curve. I discovered Google, everything I ever wanted to know I could find. As I said, I happened into this debate, and while I already knew that evolution was at least mostly true, I still thought there might be some truth behind the religious aspect also, and of course, if there is, then I wanted to find out about that. So for the most expert arguments available, I went to the resources where I thought I would find PhDs on either side, where I can get the most expert opinions, where they can hear each other, what they're saying to me, and back up each other's story or refute what the other has to say. And that's where I ended up on a group called Talk.Origins. And I investigated all the claims that were made. I researched everything as well as I could. And then I started investigating other avenues. And in the course of that time, I read a few holy books. I read a lot of archaic literature. I read myriad articles on paleontology and on evolution in general, and paleontology specifically. And although my primary interest was in phylogenetic statistic taxonomy, which I've always considered since I was little to be the strongest evidence of evolution. Eventually, I had an epiphany. On the advice of coworkers and friends, I visited a community college initially to inquire about Microsoft certifications and that sort of thing. But being unfamiliar with that campus, the first building I walked into happened to be the science building. And I just happened to find myself standing in front of a wall display full of fossils that I was very familiar with, every one. And I wondered, why do I know the names and background information for all these things? Why have I been interested in this all my life and I'm not doing anything with it, or I will never be able to use it? For a layman, everything I knew about science was useless trivia. So I dropped the idea of getting an MCSE. And even though I was a high school dropout and I'm middle-aged, I went back to school in pursuit of a geoscience degree. Which, by the way, that's a lot harder to do if you have a family. If you don't yet, don't wait. There's nothing to wait for, even if it's already happened, regardless of your age. I would encourage everybody to go for a college degree that means something. It was also at about that time that I saw one of those, I saw a news story about one of those creationist museums. Sadly, there's more than one out there, and I don't remember which one this one was, but it was one of the first. And they had a display of images of what the world would be like if evolution was true. Images like birth defects, disease, starvation, animals killing each other, political subjugation, and atrocious violations of human rights. Photographs just like these, but the ones that were chosen by the Creationist Museum were decidedly more shocking. The people that were running that museum wanted to create the illusion that if we believe in evolution, that our world would really be like this, that these images would be real. The irony is, of course, that these images, just like the ones that they had chosen, were real. They weren't photoshopped, they were photojournalism, showing how the world really is in certain places, at certain times. Might I conclude that evolution must be real too, if in fact these images are also real? Or, conversely, if evolution was not true, if the only theory we ever had for biodiversity was a complete fantasy, a collection of frauds and falsehoods, as they always asserted, and everything really was divinely designed according to some heavenly plan, the way the creationists advertised that it was, then why are these images real? And what does that say about their version of reality? Remember that not all creationists are Christians, and not all Christians are creationists. Most, in fact, are not, globally speaking. Dr. Kenneth Miller, for example, is an evolutionary biologist and a traditional Catholic in a stirring performance that I will not be able to duplicate here. He said that in the broadest sense, he believes in an intelligent designer. But he testified against intelligent design in the Kitzmiller-Walsh versus Dover trial because intelligent design was just another brand of creationism. Creationism is not simply the belief that God designed or created the universe. There are many evolutionists who believe that he did. So the word evolutionist obviously doesn't mean atheist either. We could define it as someone who generally accepts adequately supported implications of science, meaning not only do we accept evolution, but also abiogenesis, Big Bang cosmology, plate tectonics, atomic chemistry, and anything else creationists feel compelled to deny. It applies to anyone who thinks that positive claims should require positive evidence, and that there be a means to distinguish statements of fact from the delusions of illusion, and that we have a way of testing the testimonies that we hear to find out how accurate they are, and to find and correct any flaws in our current perception to improve our understanding, which is the purpose of science, and the reason that we support core principles like methodological naturalism. Now, also known as the scientific method, of course. Defining evolutionism this way, I have to also define creationism since I left it ambiguous. It can be defined as a dogmatic subset of religious believers who may object to everything science is or does, both in principle and practice, in favor of an admitted bias toward a predetermined conclusion, unsupported by evidence, but which must be defended against an unwavering obstinacy. And should anyone feel offended by my generalization, let me clarify. If you believe in God, and you believe that God created the universe, that he designed all life, but that he designed and employed natural laws and causes to that end, then you are not a creationist. Because a creationist rejects evolution by definition. Because what they really object to is naturalism. They quite literally support the idea that everything happened by magic instead. They don't usually call it magic. They will usually call it a supernatural miracle from a supernatural source, but it means the same thing. Wish I didn't have to waste any more time explaining the difference in perspectives, but the topic I want to lead into requires this preface. Creationism differs from mainstream theistic beliefs in that it attempts to make a statement on science. Some of these statements can be tested, and those that can be have all invariably proven to be wrong. It relies on the assumption that Scripture, rather than God, is an unquestionable authority, absolute. And they don't seem to distinguish doctrine from deity. Although inherently human, our interpretations must be suspect. Though they claim divine guidance, so that they can also claim that their interpretations are absolutely infallible. Even when they disagree with other creationists also claiming infallible interpretations that may be very different. And when they say that Scripture says things that it doesn't anywhere imply, or when they say it doesn't mean things that it clearly does say. Very often it doesn't matter what the Scriptures say at all, just what they want to believe that it says. This brand of dogmatism allows baseless assertions to be presented as though they were a matter of demonstrable fact, and it allows any and all facts of reality to be dismissed simply because they don't want to accept it. All of the leading creationist organizations post statements like this, attesting to the fact that they will not change their mind, even when they know that they are evidently wrong. And there are occasions in which certain people will tell you, well, maybe these are what the facts are, but this is what I prefer to believe. That, in a sense, is the creationism movement. It means never having to admit that you're wrong. Or that also, of course, means that your perspective can never improve, because the only way to improve your perspective is to realize where the flaws are and to correct them. That can't happen if you won't admit that flaws can even exist. I tried to point this out to a young Muslim who was having a discussion with me face-to-face. He was trying to make a quick exit before having to concede an uncomfortable truth. And he told me, look, you're never going to change my mind, and I'm never going to change yours. And I voted him to say that he was only half right. Whereas he does not yet know what facts I may present. He knows already that he is forbidden to allow any of my arguments to convince him, no matter how right I may be. For him, it is this is enforced on pain of death, followed by the threat of a fate worse than death. Neither of these applies to me. If he can adequately support his point, I will concede that he is wrong, even if I don't want to, because for me, it's not a matter of what I want to believe. Only accurate information has practical application. So if he can prove his point, I will concede it, even if I don't want to. Because it is better to be proven wrong than to forever be wrong and never know it. Thus, I am open to change my mind where he is not, and is determined not to, no matter what. Theirs is a very black or white perspective, where there are only two choices between absolutely right and absolutely wrong. There are no extenuating circumstances, no provisional conditions. Everything is typically either 100% or zero. So one of the first, or at least most common falsehoods asserted in any discussion of the details of believing in evolution is the dichotomy that God would not or could not be involved in the orchestration of natural processes culminating in the origin and development of our species. Meaning that it was all either simultaneously sparked into being as an incantation, exactly like the story says, or if otherwise, meaning that the fable is wrong, then God himself cannot exist. If the story, God, in their perspective, appears to be that God's existence depends on the accuracy of the story and not the other way around. There are a couple of times when I hope to illustrate that we are not quite as unique as we imagine ourselves to be. So, if the story is not correct, then God must not even exist. Not their version of it, nor any superior version of it either. And God, they say, is the source of human morality. the common law between all humanity, a universal code of honor. No. Arguably, there are no political ideologies. We can't argue that all political ideologies or religious convictions all share quite the same code of honor. There are profound conflicts just within religious doctrines, even within those books dedicated to the same gods. It's hard not to watch that while I'm talking. Even between, especially when you look back through time and look at the things that were once said to be endorsed by God himself in the old books, and which are now considered repugnant by many, most, sadly still not all, citizens of modern society. We don't even have a rigid definition of what good or evil even means. So it doesn't seem to be that there is any one moral guide we can all agree on, and what is usually promoted as such obviously comes from many different authors with often violently opposed opinions. But without an authority that is both singular and absolute for all the world's humanity, they say, we should be naught but animals, and we should behave like animals, which means we should run around killing and raping each other, and destroying all in wild abandon. The problem with that is just like the problems that were just like the photographs that were shown in the museum. Animals typically don't act like that. Usually only people do, and statistically at least. Those claiming superior morality through some brand of dogmatism are frequently found to be among the worst offenders. Ironically, some of the more desperate believers even say that fear of their God's inevitable vengeance is the only reason that they don't commit random acts of evil right now. That were it not for the threat of eternal damnation, they would run amok right away. And quite happily, as if anyone could actually be happy behaving like that, because again, it's not natural. Other animals don't act like that, and neither, oddly enough, do those of us whose morality is neither influenced nor enforced by any threat of damnation. So what went wrong? It's not what I'm here to talk about. Rather, I prefer to answer the question so commonly asked, where did morality come from, if we are to ascribe a purely natural explanation for all things? The only critics of evolution, those whom I just described, imagine that natural selection favors traits only specific to fight or flight, the war between predator and prey. Remember that they think that it is supposed to be a choice between the quick and the dead, that only the strong survive rather than the fittest, the best adapted, or the most versatile. Usually it is the most flexible species that win the day. But I've been told that we evolutionists are all supposed to believe as Friedrich Nietzsche did. Nietzsche famously said, "That which does not kill us makes us stronger." But I don't believe that. That which does not kill us might just leave us disabled, disfigured, dismembered, discouraged, distressed, dependent, and in need of therapy. There's another type of selective advantage they're overlooking: those who have the best parents. Because evolution isn't just about survival. It's not just about getting your genes to the next generation, but allowing your genes to spread in popularity so that they go branching out through other clans in interrelationships, so that they spread throughout whole communities. This is population mechanics. And it is this level of mathematic application that evolution's detractors don't understand and won't consider. Of course, Darwin said that it is the fittest who survive, meaning not just those best adapted to their environment, but those with the best genetics to start with, the most functionally efficient, obviously. But he also discovered another, or he also highlighted another way of ensuring that our genes make it to the next generation. Have a whole lot of babies. And obviously, since then, we've discovered the economics of biological development. And we realized that not every species can procreate that often. It's not the right answer. In some cases, something else need be done. In some instances, the parents need to step up and guard the brood. And we all know that evolution isn't a ladder of progression. Natural selection, biodiversity, tends to check every avenue at once, even keeps checking things that were never productive before. And you can have parrots who scatter their seeds to the wind without a care. At least they're doing better than the ones who eat their own kids. But if a trait emerges wherein some grisly thing actually tolerates these helpless morsels, then that sets the stage for progression. Because these imps have the edge over orphan or abandoned spawn having to hit the ground running to fend for themselves. Another common criticism of evolution is that birds could not have evolved from dinosaurs because they would have to go from having a fully functional arm to having a fully functional wing. That's too much mutation for one generation. It means it would be a long enduring intermediate stage wherein a partially feathered arm wouldn't yet be functional as a wing. And because such a dramatic transition might also diminish the function of the arm, then natural selection, being blind and unguided and not having any future goal in mind, wouldn't be able to favor such an adaptation, or such a development, rather. Let's see if I can throw a slide here. The summary of the argument is, what good is half a wing? What good indeed? Oviraptor provides the best illustration of this. Their fossils were commonly found among eggs. As this relatively recent but already outdated depiction shows, that's how they got their name. They were thought to be egg thieves. Obviously, it's not stealing these eggs. This is one of the most informative fossils ever discovered because it singularly addresses a number of earlier misconceptions. There is no reason why this dinosaur would sit on these eggs like a hen unless it were warm-blooded. Now, these were from a line of dinosaurs called Maniraptors, which had folding wrists and wishbones and many other avian features. And through other lines of evidence, we've also discovered that the other members of this family also had feathers. Here indicated on the arm of Velociraptor, that's the A depiction. You see the little red square there. Slide B shows a detail of that. Slide C is the same thing found on the bone of a turkey, and we see it fully dressed with feathers in slide D. This is on the arm of a vulture. See, Jurassic Park was wrong too, as velociraptors evidently look more like this. Now, the size of the wing is depicted by feather impressions of other dinosaurs like Caudipteryx. So we know that the wings on many of these were actually no bigger than this. Of course, this animal cannot fly. What can it do? What good would a half a wing be? Remember that feathers are much better insulation than fur. And where is the arm? The feathers enable this animal to better insulate a larger clutch of eggs that would normally have succumbed to the environment. So obviously, more young will be born to an oviraptor with half a wing than to one with no wings at all. Her genes will be passed down through other generations, whereas dinosaurs with thinner plumage or none would diminish. But she's not just passing on traits for some particular placement of feathers. She's passing on traits of maternal bonding. This is where dinosaurs are distinct from the common concept of reptiles. There are many species whose parents' role is so slight that they must be born fully capable. These are the species commonly referred to as cold-blooded in both the literal and metaphorical sense. The only animals with compassion are those who were once dependent. And so the half-winged here, rather like the mammaries that give our class its name, enforce a term of bonding that is already innate. In dogs, it causes them to turn the underbelly, which is a bond of trust to them, with monkeys like ourselves. We have only 2 teats left. and they require that we actually coddle our young. Just as it is mathematically obvious that a creature that does not eat its young has an evolutionary advantage over one that will, it is that much more advantageous to have a parent who dedicates their own existence toward the preservation of their spawn. And of course, we all know mothers of many species who will risk their own lives to that end. Which brings me to the concept of altruism. Arguably the most noble of all behaviors. Is it only mothers who show it? As evolution integrates these traits and eventually embeds them into our reproductive drives, we feel the loss of our babies. And grieving mothers will actually adopt the orphans of another, and they don't even have to be of the same species. This fulfills a need on both their ends. But while maternal bonds are the most compelling examples of evolution we typically think of, or devotion we typically think of, they are not without parallel when we come to the larger spectrum of social animals. Ants, termites, and bees have a social order of selfless commitment that is alien to anything vertebrates could relate to, because the individual is insignificant, completely lost amid the needs of the parent collective, the dominant collective, I should say. And the closest comparison we can make is the herd mentality. It's like the old joke where two guys are running from a bear, and one says, "You can't outrun a bear," and the other one says, "I don't have to. I just have to run faster than you." Critics of evolution would say that this sort of callous selfishness, looking out for number one, is the best we can expect from natural selection. But what if both men in turn prepared to defend each other? If successful, would such an inclination also be passed down like any other trait? When I was 12 years old, back in the Nixon years in 1974, I was walking home from junior high, middle school now, and I disrupted a murder of crows in this field, and one of them left behind. Couldn't fly on the mountain, just didn't seem healthy enough to get away. So for one brief and glorious moment for the life of a 12-year-old, I had a pet crow. And then I had this ominous sensation. I looked up and saw a funnel cloud of large black birds descending on yours truly. And I was hammered in the back of the head all the way home from school, and all the way to school the next day, and all the way home again as well. Every day on my way to school or on my way home, I was hounded by these voracious birds. Nobody believed me, by the way. Imagine the humiliation of this going on in my everyday life. And it kept on until the weather got warm enough that I stopped wearing my brown corduroy jacket. I was then able to cross the field safely and see all the birds gathering expectantly for some corduroy kid. Of course, this anecdotal example isn't the only one we have. More recently, anyone with an internet connection has seen what happens when even dumb animals realize that the needs of the many, or the needs of the one, may outweigh the needs of the many. This is called Battle at Kruger. It was accidentally shot. I mean, just a home movie, as you can see, but it's a very dramatic thing. Anyone who has not seen this video, I have to warn you now, I choked up at it. It is inspirational. In the cold and cruel rule of evolution, a young weakling is singled out from the herd by a pride of lions. Working together, they wrestle this weakling up out of the water, and then they find some other natural competition in the form of a crocodile one did not see there. We have a baby now being pulled apart by a half a dozen lions and a crocodile on the other end. Fortunately, this collection of lions gathered together are stronger than one croc. This is fortunate also for the calf. explain why in a moment. I apparently didn't time this very well. I edited this for this purpose. Maybe I edited it. It's the long version. Can you imagine what watching this had to be like for the people holding the camera? So, it's a fortunate thing that these lions realize that working together they can beat the crocodile, but they also passed the lesson to the next animal over, who figured out that a whole herd united, single-minded, can actually strip these lions of a bit of their pride. They all have the same intent. There is an element of urgency here. And it's an interesting face-off, to say the least. The first bull who charges into this herd knows what half a dozen lions will do to a buffalo. There is nothing efficient about the way a lion kills. It's horrific. It's agonizing. But he knows he has to act. He can't wait. There's an urgency. The calf is going to die imminently if he doesn't do something, whether his compatriots have gathered their strength yet or not. He also knows that where the lions will work together, they won't be able to take him down because his brethren will not allow it. This is where morality comes from. The unity of community demands cooperation, and that necessitates that we ascribe a value to someone else's life comparable to our own. And isn't it remarkable how a 500-pound cat is reduced to kittenhood in an environment like this? I've been looking at the screen. Have they yet released the cat?
Not yet.
Coming up. As I've already given away, that calf is alive. You see one lion still hanging on. He's about to face somebody, and I mean face them. And you're going to see a very definite, let go. And indeed he does.
Yeah.
See that?
Yeah. You may leave now.
Yes. You are not welcome. You are not hiding. You are not the coolest animals in this jungle. I have seen this replayed and re-edited very often with triumphant music. And there's one left. You're tuned.
There it goes.
Yeah, and remarkably, as you saw, they saved the calf. And the important lesson here is that sometimes even learned behaviors can be passed down. Now, when we're discussing the element of morality, then obviously altruism is not the only topic. Most people, it seems, think that whatever is moral or immoral is always somehow related to sex. Women in miniskirts have promiscuous people have loose morals, and gay men, no morals at all. I laughed for 15 minutes.
Wrong on so many levels.
And of course, who are our ultimate moral guides? I want to tell you in advance, I did not put the slide on that I wanted to put on because my wife thought that the audience maybe makes people's senses of humor may not be as dark as mine.
Do it.
Who did she decide was the ultimate moral guide? Well, of course, it's the clergy. Completely forgot where it was.
Ultimate moral guy.
Yeah. But if we're not talking about acts of violence or victimization, if we're only talking about sexual gratification between equals and always with mutual consent, then obviously there is not any single universal standard for morality. Otherwise, we wouldn't have these things. This is a pair of New Mexico whiptail lizards, a species composed entirely of female clones, which reproduce parthenogenically. But as you can see, they're not entirely asexual. These lesbians are not fighting. They're mating. They require a mock courtship, the climax of which is actually required to initiate their reproductive system. So, if there was a single universal arbiter of sexual morality who also happened to have designed all animal species, then he also designed this species, and he made it so that this is the only way they can reproduce. So, he obviously doesn't object to homosexual lovers nibbling each other's backsides. Humanity's closest cousins, or their closest living relatives, chimpanzees, are divided into two distinct groups. The typical chimpanzee, the troglodyte, that's the larger one, and the dwarf chimpanzee, now recognized as the bonobo. These two groups illustrate either extreme on the issue of morality because they are in the class of lovers or fighters. Now, troglodytes are the only non-human species I know of who engage in actual war. They fight with fists just like we do. They use clubs, they throw stones. They'll even sharpen sticks, just like we do. In most animal societies, whenever there is a fight, most of the other individuals in a particular social group will get out of the way. In some instances, somebody may try to jump in and break it up. But in chimpanzee societies, when there is a fight, it divides the group into factions of enemies or allies, just as it does with us. But what makes them warriors is that chimpanzees will send out armed raiding parties to take over land, to take over food supplies, to conquer and even commit genocide. Whether it's other chimpanzees, whether it's bonobos, or whether it's colobus monkeys, they will be defeated, they will be run out, they may even be eaten. Their lands will be conquered, and their supplies absconded. Bonobos, on the other hand, are like a passive society of vegetarian hippies, working together, gathering sticks and such, as if for some sort of a communal, collective commune sort of thing. Having all the resources they need, they're content to live a lifestyle like bohemian suburbanites. Primatologist Sue Ravitch-Rumbach, who studies them in the Georgia State Preserve, says that bonobos are, or the bonobo society is both egalitarian and empathetic. She describes them as the happiest species on the planet. She also says that their sexuality is embarrassingly human-like. They are very openly sexual and sometimes bisexual. They engage in deep tongue kissing, oral sex, group sex, partner swapping, and of course masturbation. But they haven't gone blind or succumbed to any of the other ravages of sin that so many of the moral majority have warned us against. In fact, they seem very well adjusted and have very good, strong bonds in their community. So which of these species are more likely to be judged as immoral? Obviously, morality should not be a matter of forced obedience, nor of trying to deny sexual drives even when they may be natural and healthy. Nor is it necessarily an adherence to traditional rituals or customs. In fact, it's only a traditional custom to say that it should be. Judgments of morality should be reserved from such trivialities and instead be concerned primarily with issues of abuse or compassion. We've all heard that it's a dog-eat-dog world out there, but dogs don't really eat dogs, do they? Why not? They're obviously intelligent, they're compassionate, they show love just as obviously as they show pain, and these senses are matched only in their empathy. In fact, studies have shown, let me see who did them, so I forgot to check these. Studies have shown that dogs can read our emotions better than wolves or even chimpanzees, because Canis lupus familiaris has evolved alongside Homo sapiens sapiens. And they already had a sense of how others must feel, because they're communal animals. They use pack strategies to do together what none alone could have done by themselves. And so do we. That's why we bonded with them. And one of the traits we share with them is binocular vision. We've had it since we were just little monkeys. And this gave us better depth perception of the trees, but at the expense of peripheral vision. As early primates had few defenses and a great many enemies, it meant that we had to have others watch our backs. And if we did see trouble coming, we would have to give an audible warning, one that would evoke an immediate response without prior investigation. This is part of where language comes from. There's one group of old world monkeys that has been shown to make a particular sound every time they see a leopard, only when they see a leopard. And that sound is distinct from another sound that they make every time they see a snake, but only when they see a snake. And the response that follows each is completely different too. One sends them up the trees, the other tells them to static. Now, our increased dependence on communication of this sort created a selective pressure for increasing our intelligence, because if you're not paying attention, you tend to get removed from the gene pool. We are now the smartest of all animals, that is true, but before we were all that smart, we were relatively weak compared to everything competing against us or coming after us. The chimpanzees and gorillas probably survived because they're exceptionally strong. But every other lineage, physically and intellectually similar to our own, has since died out such that we are the only one left. So perhaps our ancestors cared about each other a little more generously, and that probably gave us the edge. We often imagine that if we built intelligent robots, or if we ever encountered extraterrestrial aliens, that they would think like we do. Or if they didn't have our emotions, then they would be completely illogical and have no emotions at all. But even if their intellect was otherwise a perfect parallel of the human mind, and even included feral emotions like fear and rage, it would still be unlikely that we would have the human capacity for compassion without a few specific traits that evolved only in our line. Just like dogs and elephants and a lot of other mammals, humans also feel love. And those who argue that love is uniquely human also say that it can't be tested in any objective way, implying that it must be supernatural and all that implies. But we've since discovered that even something as abstract as love has a definite chemical signature. And this applies even in the long-term relationships after the initial lust and attraction have faded. Amazingly, even empathy has now been detected electrochemically. Those of us who follow the TED Talks may have caught neuropsychologist Dr. Ramachandran promoting Indian philosophy in his discussion of what he called Gandhi neurons. They're a subset of motor and sensory neurons that fire when we're watching someone else do something, as if we were doing it ourselves. Now, Dr. Ramachandran suggests that this is a sort of empathy. It enables us to learn by example. We are putting ourselves in someone else's position. And these are particularly located in the prefrontal lobes. Tendencies towards sociopathic aberrations may be physically detectable in this area also. Researchers at USC Irvine have found correlations between the underdeveloped prefrontal lobes and violent or criminal behavior. The implication is that those who lack compassion, those who don't feel pity or remorse or fear, those who will not apologize except under duress and never sincerely, because they either project or deflect blame and will not admit or accept responsibility for their own mistakes, likely have underdeveloped or physically damaged prefrontal lobes. I imagine all of you are thinking about who fits that description from your personal experience. Of course, certain drugs have also been identified as a catalyst for this and other related cognitive dysfunctions as well. And sadly, those types of drugs tend to be popular with people already of this condition, and this is why we had to have laws and a means to enforce them. For any society to advance, it must necessarily minimize pathological behaviors and usually eliminates or isolates these from the environments they threaten, according to their various systems of social order. Sometimes that means banishing or incarcerating sociopaths, unless they're the ones in charge. Then it might mean having a law mandating the murder of infidels. And we can all see where that society would be in a few generations, especially when those concordant with that rule are also encouraged to procreate. So, out of control. Sadly, that has been a recurrent case in our history. Fortunately, though, reasonable, logical rationalism is recurrent too, as if common sense was a cultural atavism. We may see our culture largely divided between iconoclasts branded as radicals and paranoid reactionaries who criticize skepticism and praise gullibility. But the vast majority of the population holds the middle ground and doesn't want to hear from either extreme. I've tried to get my religious friends to watch Pat Robertson or to read Chick tracts, and they just won't do it. They don't want to hear him any more than they want to hear me. But once the masses finally awaken to these sorts of influences in our society, then oppressive societies that are based on prohibition rather than opportunity cannot remain dominant because they have nothing to offer. There's no practical advantage where you do have that with contemplation and compassion and knowledge and perception. Curiosity may have killed a cat, but it made us what we are today. So the default position and natural condition of humanity desires to lean toward love, pity, and charity, which are all dependent on some degree of empathy, which evidently evolved with and is thus integral to socially cooperative animals. Like so many other splendid patterns in nature, these behavior traits are apparently not delivered from the top down. Rather, they've evidently emerged from the bottom up. Cooperation created society, and society determines its laws and norms accordingly. It is obviously to the benefit of all that we not only defend but also promote and encourage our sons and daughters as well as our kinsmen, friends, and fellows. And of course, we must trust in all of them as they must trust in us. It is inherent to our nature that we value each other, and to various degrees we instinctually feel for one another. That's why we can't all be liars and killers and thieves, and that's why most of us don't even want to be. This is how morality evolves in higher animals, because society can't function without it, or society can't function otherwise, and we can't function without it. Thank you. What winter is like here in Florida. Well, spring comes early. For those of you who don't know who I am, to adequately introduce myself, one of the first things I feel like to tell you is that I spend way too much of my time debating evolution versus creationism. I'm embarrassed to admit how much of my life I've dedicated to this particular venture, especially over the last decade or so. Almost since I discovered the internet, I happened across this debate, and I've been inextricably involved with it ever since. And before Y2K, I used to work for an internet service provider that offered unlimited overtime and unbridled browsing on a high-speed connection for 70 to 100 hours a week. And I investigated everything. I was suddenly on a learning curve. I discovered Google, everything I ever wanted to know I could find. As I said, I happened into this debate, and while I already knew that evolution was at least mostly true. I still thought there might be some truth behind the religious aspect also, and of course, if there is, then I wanted to find out about that. So for the most expert arguments available, I went to the resources where I thought I would find PhDs on either side, where I can get the most expert opinions, where they can hear each other.
All right, our next speaker. I found a couple years ago on YouTube, and I subscribed right away. I was very impressed with how he deals with science and a lot of the myths that people have about science. It was kind of a little bit difficult to get here. He's from Dallas, Texas. They got a foot of snow yesterday. So his flight was canceled. We got him a second flight, which stopped in Atlanta. And guess who got snow next? So at about 4 o'clock in the morning, we finally picked Aaron up, got him into bed, and he was kind of pressed for time this morning. All right. So a lot of you in the audience already know who Aaron Roth is. So I'm going to hand the mic over to him and hope you enjoy it. Thanks.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me come down. It's an honor to be invited. I've never been to Florida. I'm happy to be here. It looks nice. Who would have thought Florida would be pretty? Dallas normally is too, but you have plants here I've never seen. It's great to get out, especially when you got a foot of snow at home. And they told me as soon as I got here that this is photographs just like these, but the ones that were chosen by the Creationist Museum were decidedly more shocking. The people that were running that museum wanted to create the illusion that if we believe in evolution, that our world would really be like this, that these images would be real. The irony is, of course, that these images, just like the ones that they had chosen, were real. They weren't photoshopped, they were photojournalism, showing how the world really is in certain places, at certain times. Might I conclude that evolution must be real too, if in fact these images are also real? Or, conversely, if evolution was not true, if the only theory we ever had for biodiversity was a complete fantasy, a collection of frauds and falsehoods, as they always asserted, and everything really was divinely designed according to some heavenly plan, the way the creationists advertised that it was, then why are these images real? And what does that say about their version of reality? Remember that not all creationists are Christians. Information for all these things. Well, I've been interested in this all my life, and I'm not doing anything with it, or I will never be able to use it. For a layman, everything I knew about science was useless trivia. So I dropped the idea of getting an MCSE. And even though I was a high school dropout and I'm middle-aged, I went back to school in pursuit of a geoscience degree. Which, by the way, that's a lot harder to do after you have a family. If you don't yet, don't wait. There's nothing to wait for, even if it's already happened, regardless of your age. I would encourage everybody to go for a college degree that means something. It was also at about that time that I saw I saw a news story about one of those creationist museums. Sadly, there's more than one out there, and I don't remember which one this one was, but it was one of the first. And they had a display of images of what the world would be like if evolution was true. Images like birth defects, disease, starvation, animals killing each other, political subjugation, and atrocious violations of human rights. What they're saying to me, and back up each other's story or refute what the other has to say. And that's where I ended up on a group called Talk.Origins. And I investigated all the claims that were made. I researched everything as well as I could. And then I started investigating other avenues. And in the course of that time, I read a few holy books. I read a lot of archaic literature. I read myriad articles on paleontology and on evolution in general, and paleontology specifically. And although my primary interest was in phylogenetics, statistic taxonomy, which I've always considered since I was a little boy to be the strongest evidence of evolution. Eventually, I had an epiphany. On the advice of coworkers and friends, I visited a community college initially to inquire about Microsoft certifications and that sort of thing. But being unfamiliar with that campus, the first building I walked into happened to be the science building. And I just happened to find myself standing in front of a wall display full of fossils that I was very familiar with, every one. And I wondered, why do I know the names and background